Canto 15 of Don Juan by Gordon Lord Byron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Gallagher. What should follow slips from my reflection. Whatever follows, nevertheless may be as apropos of hope or retrospection as though the lurking thought had followed free. All life is but an interjection, an oh or ah of joy or misery, or ha ha or bah, or a yawn or pooh, of which perhaps the latter is most true. But more or less the whole's a syncope or a singletus, emblems of emotion, the grand antithesis to ennui, wherewith we break our bubbles on the ocean, that watery outline of eternity, or miniature at least, as is my notion, which ministers unto the soul's delight in seeing matters which are out of sight. But all are better than the sigh suppress'd, corroding in the cavern of the heart, making the countenance a mask of rest, and turning human nature to an art. Few men dare show their thoughts of worst or best. Dissimulation always sets apart a corner for herself, and therefore fiction is that which passes with least contradiction. Who can tell, or rather who cannot remember without telling, passion's errors? The drainer of oblivion, even the sot, hath got blue devils for his morning mirrors. What though on Lethe's stream he seems to float, he cannot sink his tremors or his terrors. The ruby glass that shakes within his hand leaves a sad sentiment of time's worst sand. And as for love, love, we will proceed. The Lady Adeline Amundeville, a pretty name as one would wish to read, must perch harmonious on my tuneful quill. There's music in the sighing of a reed, there's music in the gushing of a rill, there's music in all things, if men had ears. Their earth is but an echo of the spheres. The Lady Adeline, right honourable and honoured, ran a risk of growing less so, for few of the soft sex are very stable in their resolves. Alas, that I should say so! They differ as wine differs from its label when once decanted. I presume to guess so, but will not swear, yet both upon occasion till old may undergo adulteration. But Adeline was of the purest vintage, the unmingled essence of the grape, and yet bright as a new Napoleon from its mintage, or glorious as a diamond richly set. A page where time should hesitate to print age, and for which nature might forgo her debt. Sole creditor whose process doth involve in't the luck of finding everybody solvent. O death, thou dunnest of all duns! Thou daily knockest at doors, at first with modest tap, like a meek tradesman, when, approaching palely some splendid debtor he would take by sap. But oft denied, as patience 'gins to fail, he advances with exasperated rap, and, if let in, insists in terms unhandsome on ready money, or a draft on ransom. Whate'er thou takest, spare awhile poor beauty. She is so rare, and thou hast so much prey. What though she now and then may slip from duty, the more's the reason why you ought to stay. Gaunt gourmand, with whole nations for your booty, you should be civil in a modest way. Suppress then some slight feminine diseases, and take as many heroes as heaven pleases. Fair Adeline, the more ingenuous where she was interested, as was said, because she was not apt, like some of us, to like too readily, or too high bred to show it, points we need not now discuss, would give up artlessly both heart and head unto such feelings as seemed innocent, for objects worthy of the sentiment. Some parts of Juan's history, which rumour, that live gazette, had scattered to disfigure, she had heard. But women hear with more good humour such aberrations than we men of rigour. Besides, his conduct since in England grew more strict, and his mind assumed a manlier vigour, because he had, like Alcibiades, the art of living in all climes with ease. His manner was perhaps the more seductive, because he ne'er seemed anxious to seduce. Nothing affected, studied, or constructive of coxcombry or conquest. No abuse of his attractions marr'd the fair perspective, to indicate a Cupidon broke loose, and seem'd to say, "Resist us if you can," which makes a dandy, while it spoils a man. They are wrong, that's not the way to set about it, as, if they told the truth, could well be shown. But right or wrong, Don Juan was without it. In fact, his manner was his alone. Sincere he was, at least you could not doubt it, in listening merely to his voice's tone. The devil hath not in all his quivers choice An arrow for the heart, like a sweet voice. By nature soft, his whole address held off suspicion. Though not timid, his regard was such as rather seem'd to keep aloof, to shield himself, than put you on your guard. Perhaps 'twas hardly quite assured enough, but modesty's at time its own reward, like virtue. And the absence of pretension will go much farther than there's need to mention. Serene, accomplished, cheerful, but not loud, insinuating without insinuation, observant of the foibles of the crowd, yet ne'er betraying this in conversation. Proud with the proud, yet courteously proud, so as to make them feel he knew his station and theirs. Without a struggle for priority, he neither brooked nor claimed superiority. That is, with men. With women he was what they pleased to make or take him for, and their imagination's quite enough for that, so that the outlines tolerably fair, they fill the canvas up, and verbum sat. If once their fantasies be brought to bear upon an object, whether sad or playful, they can transfigure brighter than a Raphael. Adeline, no deep judge of character, was apt to add a colouring from her own. 'Tis thus the good will amiably err, and eke the wise, as often has been shown. Experience is the chief philosopher, but saddest when his science is well known. And persecuted sages teach the schools their folly, in forgetting there are fools. Was it not so, great Locke, and greater Bacon, great Socrates? And thou divinest still, whose lot it is by man to be mistaken, and thy pure creed made sanction of all ill? Redeeming worlds to be by bigots shaken, how was thy toil rewarded? We might fill volumes with similar sad illustrations, but leave them to the conscience of the nations. I perch upon an humbler promontory, amidst life's infinite variety, with no great care for what is nicknamed glory, but speculating as I cast mine eye on what may suit or may not suit my story, and never straining hard to versify, I rattle on exactly as I'd talk with anybody in a ride or walk. I don't know that there may be much ability shown in this sort of desultory rhyme, but there's a conversational facility which may round off an hour upon a time. Of this I'm sure at least, there's no civility in mine irregularity of chime, which rings what's uppermost of new or hoary, just as I feel the improvisatori. Omnia vult belle mato dicere, dic aliquando et bene, dic neutrum, dic aliquando male. The first is rather more than mortal can do, the second may be sadly done, or gaily, the third is still more difficult to stand to, and the fourth we hear and see and say too daily. The whole together is what I could wish to serve in this conundrum of a dish. A modest hope, but modesty's my forte, and pride my feeble. Let us ramble on. I meant to make this poem very short, but now I can't tell where it may not run. No doubt, if I had wished to pay my court to critics, or to hail the setting sun of tyranny of all kinds, my concision were more, but I was born for opposition. But then 'tis mostly on the weaker side, so that I verily believe if they who now are basking in their full-blown pride were shaken down, and dogs had had their day, though at the first I might perchance deride their tumble, I should turn the other way, and wax an ultra-royalist in loyalty, because I hate even democratic royalty. I think I should have made a decent spouse, if I had never proved the soft condition. I think I should have made monastic vows, but for my own peculiar superstition. 'Gainst rhyme I never should have knock'd my brows, Nor broken my own head, nor that of Priscian, Nor worn the motley mantle of a poet, If some one had not told me to forego it. But laissez aller, knights and dames I sing Such as the time may furnish. 'Tis a flight which seems at first to need no lofty wing, Plumed by Longinus or the Stagyrite. The difficulty lies in colouring, Keeping the due proportion still in sight, With nature manners which are artificial, And rendering general that which is especial. The difference is, that in the days of old Men made the manners; manners now make men, Pinn'd like a flock, and fleeced too in their fold, At least 9, and a 9th beside of 10. Now this at all events must render cold Your writers, who must either draw again Days better drawn before, or else assume The present with their commonplace costume. We'll do our best to make the best on't. March, march, my muse, if you cannot fly, Yet flutter; and when you may not be sublime, Be arch, or starch, as are the edicts statesmen utter. We surely may find something worth research. Columbus found a new world in a cutter, Or brigantine, or pink, of no great tonnage, While yet America was in her non-age. When Adeline, in all her growing sense Of Juan's merits and his situation, Felt on the whole an interest intense, Partly perhaps because of fresh sensation, Or that he had an air of innocence, Which is for innocence a sad temptation, As women hate half measures on the whole, She 'gan to ponder how to save his soul. She had a good opinion of advice, Like all who give and eke receive it gratis, For which small thanks are still the market price, Even where the article at highest rate is. She thought upon the subject twice or thrice, And morally decided the best state is For morals, marriage; and this question carried, She seriously advised him to get married. Juan replied, with all becoming deference, He had a predilection for that tie, But that at present, with immediate reference To his own circumstances, there might lie Some difficulties, as in his own preference, Or that of her to whom he might apply; That still he'd wed with such or such a lady, If that they were not married all already. Next to the making of matches for herself And daughters, brothers, sisters, kith, or kin, Arranging them like books upon the shelf, There's nothing women love to dabble in More, like a stockholder in growing pelf, Than matchmaking in general. 'Tis no sin, certes, but a preventative, And therefore that is, no doubt, the only reason wherefore. But never yet, except of course a miss unwed, Or mistress never to be wed, or wed already, Who object to this, was there chaste dame Who had not in her head some drama Of the marriage unities, observed as strictly Both at board and bed as those of Aristotle, Though sometimes they turn out melodrames or pantomimes. They generally have some only son, Some heir to a large property, some friend of an old family, Some gay Sir John, or grave Lord George, With whom perhaps might end a line, And leave posterity undone, Unless a marriage was applied to mend The prospects and their morals; and besides, They have at hand a blooming glut of brides. From these they will be careful to select For this an heiress, and for that a beauty; For one a songstress who hath no defect, For t'other one who promises much duty; For this a lady no one can reject, Whose sole accomplishments were quite a booty; A second for her excellent connections; A third because there can be no objections. When Rapp the harmonist embargoed marriage In his Harmonious Settlement, Which flourishes, strangely enough, as yet without miscarriage, Because it breeds no more mouths than it nourishes, Without those sad expenses which disparage What nature naturally most encourages, Why call'd he harmony a state sans wedlock? Now here I've got the preacher in a deadlock, Because he either meant to sneer at harmony Or marriage, by divorcing them thus oddly. But whether Reverend Rapp learn'd this in Germany Or no, 'tis said his sect is rich and godly, pious and pure beyond what I can term any of ours, though they propagate more broadly. My objection's to his title, not his ritual, although I wonder how it grew habitual. But rap is the reverse of zealous matrons, who favour, malgré Malthus, generation, professors of that genial art, and patrons of all the modest part of propagation, which after all at such a desperate rate runs, that half its produce tends to emigration, that sad result of passions and potatoes, two weeds which pose our economic Catos. Had Adeline read Malthus? I can't tell. I wish she had. The book's the 11th commandment, which says, "Thou shalt not marry, unless well." This he, as far as I can understand, meant. 'Tis not my purpose on his views to dwell, Nor canvass what so eminent a hand meant, But certes it conducts to lives ascetic, Or turning marriage into arithmetic. But Adeline, who probably presumed that Juan had enough of maintenance, or separate maintenance, in case 'twas doom'd, as on the whole it is an even chance that bridegrooms, after they are fairly groomed, may retrograde a little in the dance of marriage, which might form a painter's fame, like Holbein's dance of death, but 'tis the same. But Adeline determined Juan's wedding in her own mind, and that's enough for woman. But then with whom? There was the sage Miss Reading, Miss Raw, Miss Flaw, Miss Showman, and Miss No Man, and the two fair co-heiresses gilt bedding. She deemed his merits something more than common. All these were unobjectionable matches, and might go on, if well wound up, like watches. There was Miss Millpond, smooth as summer's sea, that usual paragon, an only daughter, who seem'd the cream of equanimity till skimm'd. And then there was some milk and water, with a slight shade of blue, too, it might be, beneath the surface. But what did it matter? Love's riotous, but marriage should have quiet, and, being consumptive, live on a milk diet. And then there was Miss Audacia Shoestring, a dashing demoiselle of good estate, whose heart was fixed upon a star, or blue string. But whether English dukes grew rare of late, or that she had not harped upon the true string by which such sirens can attract our great, she took up with some foreign younger brother, a Russ or Turk, the one's as good as t'other. And then there was—but why should I go on? Unless the ladies should go off. There was indeed a certain fair and fairy one, of the best class, and better than her class, Aurora Raby, a young star who shone o'er life too sweet an image for such glass, a lovely being, scarce form'd or moulded, a rose with all its sweetest leaves yet folded, rich, noble, but an orphan, left an only child to the care of guardians good and kind, but still her aspect had an air so lonely. Blood is not water, and where shall we find feelings of youth like those which overthrown lie by death, when we are left, alas, behind, to feel in friendless palaces a home is wanting, and our best ties in the tomb? Early in years, and yet more infantine in figure, she had something of sublime in eyes which sadly shone as seraphs shine. All youth, but with an aspect beyond time, radiant and grave as pitying man's decline, mournful, but mournful of another's crime. She looked as if she sat by Eden's door, and grieved for those who could return no more. She was a Catholic too, sincere, austere as far as her own gentle heart allowed, and deemed that fallen worship far more dear, perhaps because 'twas fallen. Her sires were proud of deeds and days when they had filled the ear of nations, and had never bent or bowed to novel power; and as she was the last, she held their old faith and old feelings fast. She gazed upon a world she scarcely knew, as seeking not to know it. Silent, lone, as grows a flower, thus quietly she grew, and kept her heart serene within its zone. There was an awe in the homage which she drew. Her spirit seem'd as seated on a throne apart from the surrounding world, and strong in its own strength, most strange in one so young. Now it so happened, in the catalogue of Adeline, Aurora was omitted, although her birth and wealth had given her vogue beyond the charmers we have already cited. Her beauty also seemed to form no clog against her being mentioned as well fitted, by many virtues, to be worth the trouble of single gentlemen who would be double. And this omission, like that of the bust of Brutus at the pageant of Tiberius, made Juan wonder, as no doubt he must. This he expressed half smiling and half serious, when Adeline replied with some disgust, and with an air, to say the least, imperious. She marvelled what he saw in such a baby as that prim, silent, cold Aurora Raby. Juan rejoined, she was a Catholic, and therefore fittest, as of his persuasion, since he was sure his mother would fall sick, and the Pope thunder excommunication, if— But here Adeline, who seemed to pique herself extremely on the inoculation of others with her own opinions, stated, as usual, the same reason which she late did. And wherefore not? A reasonable reason, if good, is none the worse for repetition. If bad, the best way's certainly to tease on and amplify. You lose much by concision, whereas insisting in or out of season convinces all men, even a politician. Or, what is just the same, it wearies out. So the end's gained, what signifies the rout? Why Adeline had this slight prejudice, for prejudice it was, against a creature as pure as sanctity itself from vice, with all the added charm of form and feature, for me appears a question far too nice, since Adeline was liberal by nature. But nature's nature, and has more caprices than I have time or will to take to pieces. Perhaps she did not like the quiet way with which Aurora on those baubles looked which charm most people in their earlier day. For there are few things by mankind less brooked, and womankind too, if we so may say, than finding their genius stand rebuked, like Anthony's by Caesar, by the few who look upon them as they ought to do. It was not envy. Adeline had none, her place was far beyond it, and her mind. It was not scorn, which could not light on one whose greatest fault was leaving few to find. It was not jealousy, I think, but shun following the ignes fatui of mankind. It was not, but 'tis easier far, alas, to say what it was not than what it was. Little Aurora deemed she was the theme of such discussion. She was there a guest, a beauteous ripple of the brilliant stream of rank and youth, though purer than the rest, which flowed on for a moment in the beam time sheds a moment o'er each sparkling crest. Had she known this, she would have calmly smiled, she had so much, or little, of the child. Little Aurora deemed she was the theme of such discussion. She was there a guest, a beauteous ripple of the brilliant stream of rank and youth, though purer than the rest, which flowed on for a moment in the beam time sheds a moment o'er each sparkling crest. Had she known this, she would have calmly smiled, she had so much or little of the child. The dashing and proud air of Adeline imposed not upon her. She saw her blaze much as she would have seen a glowworm shine, then turned unto the stars for loftier rays. Juan was something she could not divine, being no sibyl in the new world's ways, yet she was nothing dazzled by the meteor, because she did not pin her faith on feature. His fame too, for he had that kind of fame which sometimes plays the deuce with womankind, a heterogeneous mass of glorious blame, half virtues and whole vices being combined, faults which attract because they are not tame, follies tricked out so brightly that they blind. These seals upon her wax made no impression, such was her coldness or her self-possession. Juan knew naught of such a character, high, yet resembling not his lost Haidee. Yet each was radiant in her proper sphere. The island girl, bred up by the lone sea, more warm, as lovely, and not less sincere, was nature's all. Aurora could not be, nor would be thus. The difference in them was such as lies between a flower and gem. Having wound up with this sublime comparison, methinks we may proceed upon our narrative. And as my friend Scott says, I sound my warison. Scott, the superlative of my comparative. Scott, who can paint your Christian knight, or Saracen, serf, lord, man, with such skill as none would share it, if there had not been one Shakespeare and Voltaire, of one or both of whom he seems the heir. I say, in my slight way I may proceed to play upon the surface of humanity. I write the world, nor care if the world read, at least for this I cannot spare its vanity. My muse hath bred, and still perhaps may breed, more foes by this same scroll. When I began it I thought that it might turn out so. Now I know it, but still I am, or was, a pretty poet. The conference or congress, for it ended as congresses of late do, of the Lady Adeline and Don Juan, rather blended some acids with the sweets, for she was heady. But ere the matter could be marr'd or mended, the silvery bell rang, not for dinner ready, but for that hour, called half-hour, given to dress, though ladies' robes seem scant enough for less. Great things were now to be achieved at table, with massy plate for armour, knives and forks for weapons. But what muse since Homer's able, his feasts are not the worst part of his works, to draw up in array a single day bill of modern dinners, where more mystery lurks in soups or sauces, or a sole ragout, than witches, bitches, or physicians brew? There was a goodly soup à la bonne femme, though God knows whence it came from. There was too a turbot for relief of those who cram, relieved with dindon à la Périgot. There also was, the sinner that I am, how shall I get this gourmand stanza through, soup à la Beauveau, whose relief was dory, relieved itself by pork for greater glory. But I must crowd all into one grand mess or mass, for I should stretch into detail. My muse would run much more into excess, than when some squeamish people deem her frail. But though a bon vivant, I must confess her stomach's not her peccant part. This tale, however, doth require some slight refection, just to relieve her spirits from dejection. Fowls à la Condé, slices eke of salmon, with sauces genevoise, and a haunch of venison. Wines too, which might again have slain young Amun, a man like whom I hope we shan't see many soon. They also set a glazed Westphalian ham on, whereon Apicus would bestow his benison. And then there was champagne with foaming whirls, as white as Cleopatra's melted pearls. Then there was God knows what, à l'Allemande, à l'Espagnole, Tambal and salpicon, with things I can't withstand or understand, though swallowed with much zest upon the whole, and entremet to piddle with at hand, gently to lull down the subsiding soul, while great Lucullus's robe triumphant muffles, there's fame, young partridge fillets decked with truffles. What are the fillets on a victor's brow to these? They are rags or dust. Where is the arch which nodded to the nation's spoils below? Where the triumphal chariot's haughty march? Gone to where victories must like dinners go. Further I shall not follow the research, but oh, ye modern heroes with your cartridges, when will your name lend lustre e'en to partridges? Those truffles too are no bad accessories, followed by petit puits d'amour, a dish of which perhaps the cookery rather varies, so every one may dress it to his wish, according to the best of dictionaries, which encyclopedize both flesh and fish. But even sans confiture, it no less true is, there's pretty picking in those petits puits. The mind is lost in mighty contemplation Of intellect expanded on two courses, And indigestion's grand multiplication Requires arithmetic beyond my forces. Who would suppose from Adam's simple ration That cookery could have called forth such resources As form a science and a nomenclature From out the commonest demands of nature? The glasses jingled and the palates tingled, The diners of celebrity dined well, The ladies with more moderation mingled In the feast, pecking less than I can tell. Also the younger men too, for a springald can't, Like ripe age, in gourmandise excel, But thinks less of good eating than the whisper, When seated next him, of some pretty lisper. Alas! I must leave undescribed the gibier, The salami, the consommé, the purée, All which I use to make my rhymes run glibber Than could roast beef in our rough John Bull way. I must not introduce even a spare rib here, Bubble and squeak would spoil my liquid lay. But I have dined, and must forego, alas! The chaste description even of a bécasse, And fruits, and ice, and all that art refines From nature for the service of the goût. Taste, or the gout, pronounce it as inclines Your stomach. Ere you dine, the French will do; But after, there are sometimes certain signs Which prove plain English truer of the two. Hast ever had the gout? I have not had it, but I may have, and you too, reader, dread it. The simple olives, best allies of wine, Must I pass over in my bill of fare? I must, although a favourite plat of mine, In Spain and Lucca, Athens, everywhere, On them and bread 'twas oft my luck to dine, The grass my tablecloth, in open air, On Sunium or Hymettus, like Diogenes, Of whom half my philosophy the progeny is. Amidst this tumult of fish, flesh, and fowl, And vegetables, all in masquerade, The guests were placed according to their role, But various as the various meats displayed. Don Juan sat next à l'Espagnole, No damsel, but a dish, as hath been said, But so far like a lady, that 'twas dress'd Superbly, and contain'd a world of zest. By some odd chance too, he was placed between Aurora and the Lady Adeline, A situation difficult, I ween, For man therein with eyes and heart to dine. Also the conference which we have seen Was not such as to encourage him to shine, For Adeline, addressing few words to him, With two transcendent eyes seem'd to look through him. I sometimes almost think that eyes have ears. This much is sure, that out of earshot things Are somehow echoed to the pretty dears, Of which I can't tell whence their knowledge springs. Like that same mystic music of the spheres, Which no one hears, so loudly though it rings. 'Tis wonderful how oft the sex have heard Long dialogues, which pass'd without a word. Aurora sat with that indifference Which piques a preux chevalier, as it ought. Of all offences that's the worst offence, Which seems to hint you are not worth a thought. Now Juan, though no coxcomb in pretence, Was not exactly pleased to be so caught, Like a good ship entangled among ice, And after so much excellent advice. To his gay nothings nothing was replied, Or something which was nothing, as urbanity required. Aurora scarcely look'd aside, Nor even smiled enough for any vanity. The devil was in the girl: could it be pride, Or modesty, or absence, or inanity? Heaven knows. But Adeline's malicious eyes Sparkled with her successful prophecies, And look'd as much as if to say, "I said it." A kind of triumph I'll not recommend, Because it sometimes, as I have seen or read it, Both in the case of lover and of friend, Will pique a gentleman for his own credit, To bring what was a jest to a serious end. For all men prophesy what is or was, And hate those who won't let them come to pass. Juan was drawn thus into some attention, slight but select, and just enough to express to females of perspicuous comprehensions that he would rather make them more than less. Aurora at the last, so history mentions, though probably much less a fact than guess, so far relaxed her thoughts from their sweet prison as once or twice to smile, if not to listen. From answering she began to question. This with her was rare, and Adeline, who as yet thought her predictions went not much amiss, began to dread she'd thaw to a coquette. So very difficult, they say, it is to keep extremes from meeting, when once set in motion. But she here too much refined. Aurora's spirit was not of that kind. But Juan had a sort of winning way, a proud humility, if such there be, which show'd such deference to what females say, as if each charming word were a decree. His tact, too, temper'd him from grave to gay, and taught him when to be reserved or free. He had the art of drawing people out, without their seeing what he was about. Aurora, who in her indifference confounded him in common with the crowd of flatterers, though she deem'd he'd had more sense than whispering foplings or witlings loud, commenced, from such slight things will great commence, to feel that flattery which attracts the proud rather by deference than compliment, and wins even by a delicate descent. And then he had good looks. That point was carried nem. con. amongst the women, which I grieve to say oft leads to crim. con. with the married, a case which to the juries we may leave, since with digressions we too long have tarried. Now though we know of old that looks deceive, and always have done, somehow these good looks make more impression than the best of books. Aurora, who looked more on books than faces, was very young, although so very sage, admiring more Minerva than the Graces, especially upon a printed page. But virtue's self, with all her tightest laces, has not the natural stays of strict old age, and Socrates, that model of all duty, own'd to a penchant, though discreet, for beauty. And girls of 16 are thus far Socratic, but innocently so, as Socrates. And really, if the sage sublime and Attic at 70 years had fantasies like these, which Plato's in his dialogue dramatic has shown, I know not why they should displease in virgins. Always in a modest way, observe, for that with me's a sine qua. Also observe that, like the great Lord Coke, see Littleton, whene'er I have expressed opinions two, which at first sight may look twin opposites, the second is the best. Perhaps I have a third too in a nook, or none at all, which seems a sorry jest. But if a writer should be quite consistent, how could he possibly show things existent? If people contradict themselves, can I help contradicting them? And everybody, even my voracious self? But that's a lie, I never did so, never will. How should I? He who doubts all things nothing can deny. Truth's fountains may be clear, her streams are muddy, and cut through such canals of contradiction, that she must often navigate o'er fiction. Apologue, fable, poesy, and parable are false, but may be rendered also true by those who sow them in a land that's arable. 'Tis wonderful what fable will not do. 'Tis said it makes reality more bearable. But what's reality? Who has its clue? Philosophy? No, she too much rejects. Religion? Yes, but which of all her sects? Some millions must be wrong, that's pretty clear. Perhaps it may turn out that all were right. God help us, since we have need on our career to keep our holy beacons always bright, 'Tis time that some new prophet should appear, or old indulge man with a second sight. Opinions wear out in some 1,000 years, without a small refreshment from the spheres. But here again, why will I thus entangle myself with metaphysics? None can hate so much as I do any kind of wrangle; and yet, such is my folly or my fate, I always knock my head against some angle About the present, past, or future state. Yet I wish well to Trojan and to Tyrian, For I was bred a moderate Presbyterian. But though I am a temperate theologian, And also meek as a metaphysician, Impartial between Tyrian and Trojan, As Eldon on a lunatic commission, In politics my duty is to show John Bull Something of the lower world's condition. It makes my blood boil like the springs of Hecla, To see men let these scoundrel sovereigns break law. But politics and policy and piety Are topics which I sometimes introduce, Not only for the sake of their variety, But as subservient to a moral use; Because my business is to dress society, And stuff with sage that very verdant goose. And now, that we may furnish with some matter all tastes, We're going to try the supernatural. And now I will give up all argument, And positively henceforth no temptation Shall fool me to the top up of my bent. Yes, I'll begin a thorough reformation. Indeed, I never knew what people meant By deeming that my muse's conversation Was dangerous. I think she is as harmless As some who labour more, and yet may charm less. Grim reader, did you ever see a ghost? No, but you have heard? I understand. Be dumb, and don't regret the time you may have lost, For you have got that pleasure still to come. And do not think I mean to sneer at most of these things, Or by ridicule benumb that source of the sublime and the mysterious. For certain reasons my belief is serious. Serious? You laugh. You may, that will I not. My smiles must be sincere, or not at all. I say I do believe a haunted spot exists. And where? That shall I not recall, Because I'd rather it should be forgot. Shadows upon the soul of Richard may appall. In short, upon that subject I've some qualms Very like those of the philosopher Malmesbury. The night I sing by night, sometimes an owl, And now and then a nightingale, is dim, And the loud shrieks of sage Minerva's fowl Rattles round me her discordant hymn. Old portraits from old walls upon me scowl. I wish to heaven they would not look so grim. The dying embers dwindle in the grate. I think too that I have sat up too late, And therefore, though 'tis by no means my way To rhyme at noon, when I have other things to think of, If I ever think, I say I feel some chilly midnight shudderings, And prudently postpone until midday Treating a topic which, alas, but brings shadows. But you must be in my condition Before you learn to call this superstition. Between two worlds life hovers like a star, 'Twixt night and morn upon the horizon's verge. How little do we know that which we are, How less what we may be! The eternal surge of time and tide rolls on, And bears afar our bubbles. As the old burst, new emerge, Lash'd from the foam of ages, While the graves of empire heave but like some passing waves. End of Canto 15 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. Of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Gallagher. The antique Persians taught 3 useful things: to draw the bow, to ride, and speak the truth. This was the mode of Cyrus, best of kings, A mode adopted since by modern youth. Bows have they, generally with 2 strings, Horses they ride without remorse or ruth, At speaking truth, perhaps they are less clever, but draw the long bow better now than ever. The cause of this effect, or this defect, for this effect defective comes by cause, is what I have not leisure to inspect. But this I must say in my own applause: of all the muses that I recollect, whate'er may be her follies or her flaws in some things, mine's beyond all contradiction the most sincere that ever dealt in fiction. And as she treats all things, and ne'er retreats from anything, this epic will contain a wilderness of the most rare conceits, which you might elsewhere hope to find in vain. 'Tis true there be some bitters with the sweets, yet mixed so slightly that you can't complain. But wonder they so few are, since my tale is de rebus cunctis et quibus de melius. But of all the truths which she has told, the most true is that which she is about to tell. I said it was a story of a ghost. What then? I only know it so befell. Have you explored the limits of the coast where all the dwellers of the earth must dwell? 'Tis time to strike such puny doubters dumb as the sceptics who would not believe Columbus. Some people would impose now with authority Turpin's or Monmouth Jeffrey's chronicle, men whose historical superiority is always greatest at a miracle. But Saint Augustine has the great priority, who bids all men believe the impossible, because 'tis so. Who nibble, scribble, quibble, he quiets at once with quia impossibili. And therefore, mortals, cavil not at all, believe. If 'tis improbable, you must, and if it is impossible, you shall. 'Tis always best to take things upon trust. I do not speak profanely, to recall those holier mysteries which the wise and just receive as gospel, and which grow more rooted, as all truths must, the more they are disputed. I merely mean to say what Johnson said, that in the course of some 6,000 years all nations have believed that from the dead a visitant at interval appears. And what is strangest upon this strange head is, that whatever bar the reason rears against such belief, there's something stronger still in its behalf, let those deny who will. The dinner and the soirée too were done, the supper too discussed, the dames admired, the banqueteers had dropped off one by one, the song was silent, and the dance expired. The last thin petticoats were vanish'd, gone like fleecy clouds into the sky retired, and nothing brighter gleam'd through the saloon than dying tapers and the peeping moon. The evaporation of a joyous day is like the last glass of champagne without the foam which made its virgin bumper gay, or like a system coupled with a doubt, or like a soda bottle when its spray has sparkled and left half its spirit out, or like a billow left by storms behind without the animation of the wind, or like an opiate which brings troubled rest or none, or like nothing that I know except itself. Such is the human breast, a thing of which similitudes can show no real likeness, like the old Tyrian vest, dyed purple, none at present can tell how, if from a shellfish or from cochineal. So perish every tyrant's robe piecemeal. But next to dressing for a rout or ball, undressing is a woe. Our robe de chambre may sit like that of Nessus, and recall thoughts quite as yellow, but less clear than amber. Titus exclaim'd, "I've lost a day." Of all the nights and days most people can remember, I've had of both some, not to be disdain'd. I wish they'd state how many they have gained. And Juan, on retiring for the night, felt restless and perplexed and compromised. He thought Aurora Raby's eyes more bright than Adeline such as advice advised. If he had known exactly his own plight, he probably would have philosophized, a great resource to all, and ne'er denied till wanted. Therefore Juan only sighed. He sighed The next resource is the full moon, where all sighs are deposited, and now it happened, luckily, the chaste orb shone as clear as such a climate will allow, and Juan's mind was in the proper tone to hail her with the apostrophe, "O thou!" Of amatory egoism the twoism, which further to explain would be a truism. But lover, poet, or astronomer, shepherd or swain, whoever may behold, feel some abstraction when they gaze on her. Great thoughts we catch from thence, besides a cold sometimes, unless my feelings rather err. Deep secrets to her rolling light are told, Ocean's tides and mortals' brains she sways, And also hearts, if there be truth in lays. Juan felt somewhat pensive, and disposed for contemplation rather than his pillow. The Gothic chamber where he was enclosed let in the rippling sound of the lake's billow, with all the mystery by midnight caused. Below his window waved, of course, a willow, and he stood gazing out on the cascade that flashed and after darkened in the shade. Upon his table or his toilet, which of these is not exactly ascertained, I state this, for I am cautious to a pitch of nicety where the fact is to be gained, a lamp burned high, while he leaned from a niche where many a Gothic ornament remained, in chiselled stone and painted glass, and all that time has left our fathers of their hall. Then, as the night was clear, though cold, he threw his chamber door wide open, and went forth into a gallery of a sombre hue, long furnished with old pictures of great worth, of knights and dames heroic and chaste too, as doubtless should be people of high birth. But by dim lights the portraits of the dead have something ghastly, desolate, and dread. The forms of the grim knight and pictured saint looked living in the moon, and as you turn backward and forward to the echoes faint of your own footsteps, voices from the urn appear to wake, and shadows wild and quaint start from the frames which fence their aspect stern, as if to ask how you can dare to keep a vigil there, where all but death should sleep. And the pale smile of beauties in the grave, and the charms of other days, in starlight gleams glimmer on high. Their buried locks still wave along the canvas, their eyes dance like dreams on ours, or spars within some dusky cave, but death is imaged in their shadowy beams. A picture is the past, even ere its frame be gilt, who sat hath ceased to be the same. As Juan mused on mutability, or on his mistress, terms synonymous, no sound except the echo of his sigh or step ran sadly through that antique house, when suddenly he heard, or thought so, nigh a supernatural agent, or a mouse whose little nibbling rustle will embarrass most people as it plays along the arras. It was no mouse, but lo! a monk arrayed in cowl and beads and dusky garb appeared, now in the moonlight and now lapsed in shade, with steps that trode as heavily yet unheard. His garments only a slight murmur made, he moved as shadowy as the sisters weird, but slowly, and as he passed Juan by, glanced without pausing on him a bright eye. Juan was petrified. He had heard a hint of such a spirit in these halls of old, but thought, like most men, there was nothing in't, beyond the rumour which such spots unfold, coined from surviving superstitions, mint which passes ghosts in currency like gold, but rarely seen, like gold compared with paper. And did he see this, or was it vapour? Once, twice, thrice repassed the thing of air or earth, beneath or heaven, or t'other place, and Juan gazed upon it with a stare, yet could not speak or move, but on its base as stands a statue stood. He felt his hair twine like a knot of snakes around his face, he taxed his tongue for words which were not granted, to ask the reverend person what he wanted. The third time, after a still longer pause, the shadow passed away. But where? The hall was long, and thus far there was no great cause to think his vanishing unnatural. Doors there were many, through which, by the laws of physics, bodies, whether short or tall, might come or go, but Juan could not state through which the spectre seemed to evaporate. He stood, how long he knew not, but it seemed an age, expectant. powerless, with his eyes strained on the spot where first the figure gleam'd. Then by degrees recall'd his energy, and would have passed the whole off as a dream, but could not wake. He was, he did surmise, waking already, and return'd at length back to his chamber, shorn of half his strength. All there was as he left it. Still his taper burn'd, and not blew, as modest tapers use, receiving sprites with sympathetic vapour. He rubbed his eyes, and they did not refuse their office. He took up an old newspaper, the paper was right easy to peruse. He read an article, the king attacking, and a long eulogy of patent blacking. This savoured of this world, but his hand shook, and he shut his door, and after having read a paragraph, I think about Horn took, undressed, and rather slowly went to bed. There couch'd all snugly on his pillow's nook, with what he had seen his fantasy he fed, and though it was no opiate, slumber crept upon him by degrees, and so he slept. He woke betimes, and, as may be supposed, ponder'd upon his visitant or vision, and whether it ought not to be disclosed, at risk of being quizzed for superstition. The more he thought, the more his mind was posed. In the meantime, his valet, whose precision was great, because his master brooked no less, knock'd to inform him it was time to dress. He dress'd, and like young people he was wont to take some trouble with his toilet, but this morning rather spent less time upon it. Aside his very mirror soon was put, his curls fell negligently o'er his front, his clothes were not curb'd to their usual cut, his very neckcloth's Gordian knot was tied almost an hair's breadth too much on one side. And when he walk'd down into the saloon, he sat him pensive o'er a dish of tea, which he perhaps had not discover'd soon, had it not happened scalding hot to be, which made him have recourse unto his spoon. So much distrait he was, that all could see that something was the matter, Adeline the first, but what she could not well divine. She look'd and saw him pale, and turn'd as pale herself, then hastily look'd down, and mutter'd something, but what's not stated in my tale. Lord Henry said his muffin was ill butter'd. The Duchess of Fitzfalk play'd with her veil, and look'd at Juan hard, but nothing utter'd. Aurora Raby, with her large dark eyes, survey'd him with a kind of calm surprise. But seeing him all cold and silent still, and everybody wondering more or less, fair Adeline inquired if he were ill. He started, and said, "Yes, no, rather yes." The family physician had great skill, and being present, now began to express his readiness to feel his pulse and tell the cause. But Juan said he was quite well. "Quite well, yes, no." These answers were mysterious, and yet his looks appear'd to sanction both, however they might savour of delirious. Something like illness of a sudden growth weighed on his spirit, though by no means serious. But for the rest, as he himself seem'd loath to state the case, it might be ta'en for granted it was not the physician that he wanted. Lord Henry, who had now discussed his chocolate, also the muffin whereof he complained, said Juan had not got his usual look elate, at which he marvelled, since it had not rained. Then asked her grace what news were of the duke of late. Her grace replied, his grace was rather pain'd with some light hereditary twinges of gout, which rusts aristocratic hinges. Then Henry turn'd to Juan, and addressed a few words of condolence on his state. "You look," quoth he, "as if you'd had your rest broke in upon the Black Friar of late." "What friar?" said Juan, and he did his best to put the question with an air sedate or careless, but the effort was not valid to hinder him from growing still more pallid. "Oh, have you never heard of the Black Friar, the spirit of these walls?" "In truth, not I." "Why, fame, but fame, you know, sometimes a liar, tells an odd story, which by and by. Whether with time the spectre has grown shyer, or that our sires had a more gifted eye for such sights, though the tale is half believed, the friar of late has not oft been perceived. The last time was—" "I pray," said Adeline, who watched the changes of Don Juan's brow, and from its context thought she could divine connections stronger than he chose to avow with this same legend, "if you but design to jest, you'll choose some other theme just now, because the present tale has oft been told, and is not much improved by growing old." "Jest?" quoth Milor. "Why, Adeline, you know that we ourselves— 'Twas in the honeymoon, saw—" "Well, no matter, 'twas so long ago. But come, I'll set your story to a tune. Graceful as Dian when she draws her bow, She seized her harp, whose strings were kindled soon As touch'd, and plaintively began to play The air of 'Twas a friar of orders grey." "But add the words," cried Henry, "which you made, For Adeline is half a poetess." Turning round to the rest, he smiling said, "Of course the others could not but express In courtesy their wish to see display'd By one 3 talents, for there were no less: The voice, the words, the harper's skill at once Could hardly be united by a dunce." After some fascinating hesitation, The charming of these charmers who seem bound, I can't tell why, to this dissimulation, Fair Adeline, with eyes fix'd on the ground At first, then kindling into animation, Added her sweet voice to the lyric sound, And sang with much simplicity, a merit Not the less precious that we seldom hear it. "Beware, beware of the Black Friar, who sitteth by Norman stone, For he mutters his prayer in the midnight air, And his mass of the days that are gone. When the lord of the hill, Amundeville, Made Norman church his prey, And expell'd the friars, one friar still Would not be driven away, Though he came in his might with King Henry's right To turn church lands to lay, With sword in hand and torch to light their walls if they said nay. A monk remained, unchased, unchained, And he did not seem form'd of clay, For he's seen in the porch, and he's seen in the church, Though he is not seen by day. And whether for good or whether for ill, It is not mine to say, But still with the house of Amundeville He bideth night and day. By the marriage bed of the lords, 'tis said, He flits on the bridal eve, And 'tis held as faith to their bed of death He comes, but not to grieve. When an heir is born, he's heard to mourn, And when aught is to befall that ancient line, In the wee moonshine he walks from hall to hall. His form you may trace, but not his face, 'Tis shadow'd by his cowl, but his eyes may be seen From the folds between, And they seem of a parted soul. But beware, beware of the Black Friar, He still retains his sway, For he is yet the church's heir, Whoever may be the lay. Amundeville is the lord by day, But the monk is lord by night, Nor wine nor wassail could rise a vassal To question that friar's right. Say nought to him as he walks the hall, And he'll say nought to you; He sweeps along in his dusty pall, As o'er the grass the dew. Then gramercy for the Black Friar! Heaven sain him, fair or foul! And whatsoe'er may be his prayer, Let ours be for his soul." The lady's voice ceased, and the thrilling wires Died from the touch that kindled them to sound, And the pause followed, which, when song expires, Pervades a moment those who listen round. And then, of course, the circle much admires, Nor less applauds, as in politeness bound, The tones, the feeling, and the execution, To the performer's diffident confusion. Fair Adeline, though in a careless way, As if she rated such accomplishment As the mere pastime of an idle day, Pursued an instant for her own content, Would now and then, as 'twere without display, Yet with display in fact, at times relent To such performances with haughty smile, To show she could, if 'twere worth her while. Now this, but we will whisper it aside, Was, pardon the pedantic illustration, Trampling on Plato's pride with greater pride, As did the cynic on some like occasion, Deeming the sage would be much mortified, Or thrown into a philosophic passion, For a spoiled carpet. But the Attic bee was much consoled by his own repartee. Thus Adeline would throw into the shade, By doing easily, whene'er she chose, What dilettanti do with vast parade, Their sort of half profession; for it grows To something like this when too oft display'd. And that it is so, everybody knows, who've heard Miss That, or this, or Lady T'other show off to please their company or mother. Oh, the long evenings of duets and trios, the admirations and the speculations, the mamma mias and the amo mios, the tanti palpitis on such occasions, the lasciami and the quavering adios, amongst our own most musical of nations, with tu mi cames from Portingale to soothe our ears, lest Italy should fail. In Babylon's bravuras, as the home heart ballads of Green Erin or Grey Highlands, that bring Lochaber back to eyes that roam o'er far Atlantic continents or islands, the calentures of music which o'ercome all mountaineers with dreams that they are nigh lands no more to be beheld but in such visions, was Adeline well versed as compositions. She also had a twilight tinge of blue, could write rhymes, and compose more than she wrote, made epigrams occasionally too upon her friends, as everybody ought, but still from that sublimer azure hue, so much the present dye, she was remote, and weak enough to deem Pope a great poet, and what was worse, not ashamed to show it. Aurora, since we are touching upon taste, which nowadays is the thermometer by whose degrees all characters are classed, was more Shakespearean, if I do not err. The worlds beyond this world's perplexing waste had more of her existence, for in her there was a depth of feeling to embrace thoughts boundless, deep, but silent too as space. Not so her gracious, graceful, graceless grace, the full-grown Hebe of Fitzfalk, whose mind, if she had any, was upon her face, and that was of a fascinating kind. A little turn for mischief you might trace also thereon, but that's not much. We find few females without some such gentle leaven, for fear we should suppose us quite in heaven. I have not heard she was at all poetic, though once she was seen reading the Bath Guide and Halley's Triumphs, which she deemed pathetic because, she said, her temper had been tried so much, the bard had really been prophetic of what she had gone through with since a bride. But of all verse, what most ensured her praise were sonnets to herself, or bourrimées. 'Twere difficult to say what was the object of Adeline in bringing this same lay to bear upon what appeared to her the subject of Juan's nervous feelings on that day. Perhaps she merely had the simple project to laugh him out of his supposed dismay. Perhaps she might wish to confirm him in it, though why I cannot say, at least this minute. But so far the immediate effect was to restore him to his self-propriety, a thing quite necessary to the effect who wish to take the tone of their society, in which you cannot be too circumspect, whether the mode be persiflage or piety, but wear the newest mantle of hypocrisy, on pain of much displeasing the gynocracy. And therefore Juan now began to rally his spirits, and without more explanation to jest upon such themes in many a sally. Her grace too also seized the same occasion with various similar remarks to tally, but wished for a still more detailed narration of this same mystic friar's curious doings, about the present family's death and wooings. Of these few could say more than has been said. They passed as such things do for superstition with some, while others, who had more in dread the theme, half credited the strange tradition. And much was talked on all sides on that head, but Juan, when cross-questioned on the vision which some supposed, though he had not avowed it, had stirred him, answered in a way to cloud it. And then, the midday having worn to one, the company prepared to separate, some to their several pastimes, or to none, some wondering 'twas so early, some so late. There was a goodly match, too, to be run between some greyhounds on my lord's estate, and a young racehorse of old pedigree matched for the spring, whom several went to see. There was a picture dealer who had bought a special Titian, warranted original, so precious that it was not to be bought, though princes the possessor were besieging all. The king himself had cheapened it, but thought the civil list he deigns to accept, obliging all his subjects by his gracious acceptation, too scanty in these times of low taxation. But as Lord Henry was a connoisseur, the friend of artists, if not arts, the owner with motives the most classical and pure, so that he would have been the very donor rather than the seller had his wants been fewer, so much he deemed his patronage an honour, had bought the Capodopera, not for sale, but for his judgment, never known to fail. There was a modern a Gothic bricklayer of Babel, called an architect, bought to survey these grey walls, which, though so thick, might have from time acquired some slight defect, who, after rummaging the abbey through thick and thin, produced a plan whereby to erect new buildings of correctest conformation, and throw down old, which he called restoration. The cost would be a trifle. An old song set to some thousands, 'tis the usual burden of that same tune when people hum it long. The price would speedily repay its worth in an edifice no less sublime than strong, by which Lord Henry's good taste would go forth in its glory, through all ages shining sunny, for Gothic daring shown in English money. There were 2 lawyers busy on a mortgage Lord Henry wished to raise for a new purchase, also a lawsuit upon 10 years' burgage, and one on tithes, which sure are discord's tortures, kindling religion till she throws down her gauge, untying squires to fight against the churches. There was a prize ox, a prize pig, and ploughman, for Henry was a sort of Sabine showman. There were 2 poachers caught in a steel trap, ready for jail, their place of convalescence. There was a country girl in a close cap and scarlet cloak. I hate the sight to see, since in youth I had the sad mishap, but luckily I have paid few parish fees since. That scarlet cloak, alas, unclosed with rigour, presents the problem of a double figure. A reel within a bottle is a mystery. One can't tell how it e'er got in or out, and therefore the present piece of natural history I leave to those who are fond of solving doubt, and merely state, though not for the consistory, Lord Henry was a justice, and that Scout the constable, beneath a warrant's banner, had bagged this poacher upon nature's manner. Now justices of peace must judge all pieces of mischief of all kinds, and keep the game and morals of the country from caprices of those who have not a licence for the same. And of all things, excepting tithes and leases, perhaps these are most difficult to tame. Preserving partridges and pretty wenches are puzzles to the most precautious benches. The present culprit was extremely pale as if painted so, her cheek being red by nature, as in higher dames less hale 'tis white, at least when they just rise from bed. Perhaps she was ashamed of seeming frail, poor soul, for she was country born and bred, and knew no better in her immorality than to wax white, for blushes are for quality. Her black, bright, downcast, yet a spiegel eye had gathered a large tear into its corner, which the poor thing at times essayed to dry, for she was not a sentimental mourner, parading all her sensibility, nor insolent enough to scorn the scorner, but stood in trembling, patient tribulation to be called up for her examination. Of course these groups were scattered here and there, not nigh the gay saloon of ladies' gent. The lawyers in the study, and in air the prize pig, ploughman, poachers. The men sent from town, viz. Architect and dealer, were both busy, as a general in his tent writing dispatches, in their several stations, exulting in their brilliant lucubrations. But this poor girl was left in the great hall, while Scout, the parish guardian of the frail, discussed (he hated beer yclept the small) a mighty mug of moral double ale. She waited until justice could recall its kind attentions to their proper pale, to name a thing in nomenclature rather perplexing for most virgins, a child's father. You see, here was enough of occupation for Lord Henry, linked with dogs and horses. There was much bustle too, and preparation below stairs, on the score of second courses, because, as suits their rank and situation, those who in counties have great land resources have public days, when all men may carouse, though not exactly what's called open house. But once a week or fortnight, uninvited, thus we translate a general invitation, all country gentlemen, esquired or knighted, may drop in without cards, and take their station at the full board, and sit alike delighted with fashionable wines and conversation, and, as the isthmus of the grand connection, talk o'er themselves the past and next election. Lord Henry was a great electioneerer, burrowing for boroughs like a rat or rabbit, but county contests cost him rather dearer, because the neighbouring Scotch Earl of Gift-Gabbet had English influence in the same sphere here. His son, the Honourable Dick Diced-Rabbit, was member for the other interest, meaning the same self-interest with a different leaning. Courteous and cautious, therefore, in his county, he was all things to all men, and dispensed to some civility, to others bounty, and promises to all, which last commenced to gather to a somewhat large amount, he not calculating how much they condensed. But what with keeping some and breaking others, his word had the same value as another's. A friend to freedom and freeholders, yet no less a friend to government, he held that he exactly the just medium hit twixt place and patriotism. Albeit compelled, such was his sovereign's pleasure, though unfit, he added modestly, when rebels railed, to hold some sinecures he wished abolished, but that with them all law would be demolished. He was free to confess— whence comes this phrase? Is't English? No, 'tis only parliamentary— that innovation spirit nowadays had made more progress than for the last century. He would not tread a factious path to praise, though for the public weal disposed to venture high. As for his place, he could but say this of it, that the fatigue was greater than the profit. Heaven and his friends knew that a private life had ever been his sole and whole ambition. But could he quit his king in time of strife, which threatened the whole country with perdition? When demagogues would with a butcher's knife cut through and through, oh damnable incision, the Gordian or the Geordian knot, whose strings have tied together commons, lords, and kings. Sooner come place into the civil list, and champion him to the utmost, he would keep it till duly disappointed or dismissed. Profit he cared not for, let others reap it. But should the day come when place ceased to exist, the country would have far more cause to weep it. For how could it go on? Explain who can. He gloried in the name of Englishman. He was as independent, ay, much more, than those who were not paid for independence, as common soldiers or a common shore have in their several arts or parts ascendants, or the irregulars in lust or gore, who do not give professional attendance. Thus on the mob all statesmen are as eager to prove their pride as footmen to a beggar. All this, save the last stanza, Henry said and thought. I say no more, I've said too much, for all of us have either heard or read off, or upon the hustings, some slight such hints from the independent heart or head of the official candidate. I'll touch no more on this. The dinner bell hath rung, and grace is said. The grace I should have sung, but I'm too late, and therefore must make play. 'Twas a great banquet, such as Albion old was wont to boast, as if a glutton's tray were something very glorious to behold. But 'twas a public feast and public day, quite full, right dull, guests hot and dishes cold, great plenty, much formality, small cheer, and everybody out of their own sphere. The squires familiarly formal, and my lords and ladies proudly condescending. The very servants puzzling how to hand their plates, without it might be too much bending from their high places by the sideboard stand, yet like their masters fearful of offending, for any deviation from the graces might cost both man and master too their places. There were some hunters bold and coursers keen, whose hounds ne'er erred, nor greyhounds deign'd to lurch. Some deadly shots too, Septembreezes, seen earliest to rise, and last to quit the search of the poor partridge through his stubble screen. There were some massy members of the church, takers of tithes, and makers of good matches, and several who sung fewer psalms than catches. There were some country wags too, and, alas, some exiles from the town, who had been driven to gaze instead of pavement upon grass, and rise at 9 in lieu of long 11. And lo, upon that day it came to pass I sat next that overwhelming son of heaven, the very powerful Parson Peter Pith, the loudest wit I e'er was deafen'd with. I knew him in his livelier London days, a brilliant diner out, though but a curate, and not a joke he cut, but earned its praise, until preferment, coming at a sure rate— O Providence, how wondrous are thy ways, who would suppose thy gifts sometimes obdurate— gave him, to lay the devil who looks o'er Lincoln, a fat fen vicarage, and nought to think on. His jokes were sermons, and his sermons jokes, but both were thrown away amongst the fens, for wit hath no great friend in aguish folks. No longer ready ears and shorthand pens imbibed the gay bon mot or happy hoax. The poor priest was reduced to common sense, or to coarse efforts very loud and long, to hammer a horse laugh from the thick throng. There is a difference, says the song, between a beggar and a queen, or was— of late the latter worse used of the two we've seen, but we'll say nothing of the affairs of state— a difference betwixt bishop and a dean, a difference between crockery ware and plate, as between English beef and Spartan broth, and yet great heroes have been bred by both. But of all nature's discrepancies, none upon the whole is greater than the difference beheld between the country and the town, of which the latter merits every preference from those who have few resources of their own, and only think or act or feel with reference to some small plan of interest or ambition, both which are limited to no condition. But en avant! The light loves languish o'er the long banquets and too many guests, although a slight repast makes people love much more, Bacchus and Ceres being, as we know even from our grammar upwards, friends of yore with vivifying Venus, who doth owe to these the invention of champagne and truffles. Temperance delights her, but long fasting ruffles. Dully pass'd o'er dinner of the day, and Juan took his place, he knew not where, confused in the confusion, and distrait, and sitting as if nailed upon his chair. Though knives and forks clank'd round as in a fray, he seem'd unconscious of all passing there, till some one, with a groan, express'd a wish, unheeded twice, to have a fin of fish. On which, at the third asking of the banns, he started, and perceiving smiles around broadening to grins, he coloured more than once, and hastily, as nothing can confound a wise man more than laughter from a dunce, inflicted on the dish a deadly wound, and with such hurry, that ere he could curb it, he had paid his neighbour's prayer with half a turbot. This was no bad mistake, as it occurr'd, the supplicator being an amateur, but others, who were left with scarce a third, were angry, as they well might, to be sure. They wonder'd how a young man so absurd Lord Henry at his table should endure, and this, and his not knowing how much oats had fallen at last market, cost his host 3 votes. They little knew, or might have sympathized, that he the night before had seen a ghost, a prologue which but slightly harmonized with the substantial company, engrossed by matter, and so much materialized, that one scarce knew at what to marvel most of the two things: how, the question rather odd is, such bodies could have souls, or souls such bodies. But what confused him more than smile or stare from all the squires and squiresses around, who wonder'd at the abstraction of his air, especially as he had been renowned for some vivacity among the fair, even in the country circles narrow bound, for little things upon my lord's estate were good small talk for others still less great, was that he caught Aurora's eye on his, and something like a smile upon her cheek. Now this he really rather took amiss. In those who rarely smile, their smiles bespeak a strong external motive, and in this smile of Aurora's there was nought to pique of hope or love, with any of the wiles which some pretend to trace in ladies' smiles. 'Twas a mere quite smile of contemplation, indicative of some surprise and pity, and Juan grew carnation with vexation, which was not very wise, and still less witty, since he had gained at least her observation, a most important outwork of the city, as Juan should have known, had not his senses by last night's ghost been driven from their defences. But what was bad, she did not blush in turn, nor seem embarrassed. Quite the contrary. Her aspect was as usual still, not stern, and she withdrew, but cast not down her eye, yet grew a little pale. With what? Concern? I know not, but her colour ne'er was high, though sometimes faintly flush'd, and always clear, as deep seas in a sunny atmosphere. But Adeline was occupied by fame this day, and watching, witching, condescending to the consumers of fish, fowl, and game, and dignity with courtesy so blending, as all must blend, whose part it is to aim, especially as the 6th year is ending, at their lords, sons, or similar connections, safe conduct through the rocks of re-elections. Though this was the most expedient on the whole, and usual, Juan, when he cast a glance on Adeline while playing her grand rôle, which she went through as though it were a dance, betraying only now and then her soul by a look scarce perceptibly askance, of weariness or scorn, began to feel some doubt how much of Adeline was real. So well she acted all and every part by turns, with that vivacious versatility which many people take for want of heart. They err. 'Tis merely what is called mobility, a thing of temperament and not of art, though seeming so from its supposed facility, and false, though true, for surely they're sincerest who are strongly acted on by what is nearest. This makes your actors, artists, and romancers heroes sometimes, though seldom, sages never, but speakers, bards, diplomatists, and dancers, little that's great, but much of what is clever. Most orators, but very few financiers, though all exchequer chancellors endeavour of late years to dispense with Cocker's rigours, and grow quite figurative with their figures. The poets of arithmetic are they who, though they prove not 2 and 2 to be 5, as they might do in a modest way, have plainly made it out that 4 are 3, judging by what they take and what they pay. The sinking fund's unfathomable sea, that most unliquidating liquid, leaves the debt unsunk, yet sinks all it receives. While Adeline dispensed her airs and graces, the fair Fitzfalk seemed very much at ease. Though too well bred to quiz men to their faces, her laughing blue eyes with a glance could seize the ridicules of people in all places, that honey of your fashionable bees, and store it up for mischievous enjoyment; and this at present was her kind employment. However, the day closed as days must close, the evening also waned, and coffee came, each carriage was announced, and ladies rose, and curtsying off, as curtsies country dame, retired. With most unfashionable bows their docile esquires also did the same, delighted with their dinner and their host, but with the Lady Adeline the most. Some praised her beauty, others her great grace, the warmth of her politeness, whose sincerity was obvious in each feature of her face, whose trays were radiant with the rays of verity. Yes, she was truly worthy her high place, no one could envy her deserved prosperity. And then her dress, what beautiful simplicity draperied her form with curious felicity. Meanwhile sweet Adeline reserved their praises, by an impartial indemnification for all her past exertion and soft phrases, in a most edifying conversation, which turned upon their late guests' means and faces, and families, even to the last relation, their hideous wives, their horrid selves and dresses, and truculent distortion of their tresses. True, she said little, 'twas the rest that broke forth into universal epigram, but then 'twas to the purpose what she spoke, like Addison's faint praise, so wont to damn; her own but served to set off every joke, as music chimes in with a melodram. How sweet the task to shield an absent friend! I ask but this of mine, to not defend. There were but two exceptions to this keen skirmish of wits or the departed: one, Aurora, with her pure and placid mien, and Juan too, in general behind none in gay remark on what he had heard or seen, sat silent now, his usual spirits gone. In vain he heard the others rail or rally, he would not join them in a single sally. 'Tis true, he saw Aurora look as though she approved his silence. She perhaps mistook its motive for that charity we owe but seldom pay the absent, nor would look farther. It might or might not be so. But Juan, sitting silent in his nook, observing little in his reverie, yet saw this much, which he was glad to see. The ghost at least had done him this much good, in making him as silent as a ghost, if in the circumstances which ensued he gained esteem, where it was worth the most. And certainly Aurora had renewed in him some feelings he had lately lost, or hardened; feelings which, perhaps ideal, are so divine that I must deem them real: the love of higher things and better days, the unbounded hope and heavenly ignorance of what is called the world and the world's ways, the moments when we gather from a glance more joy than from all future pride or praise, which kindle manhood, but can ne'er entrance the heart in an existence of its own, of which another's bosom is the zone. Who would not sigh, I tan Cytherean, that hath a memory, or that had a heart? Alas, her star must fade like that of Dian; ray fades on ray as years on years depart. Anacreon only had the soul to tie an unwithering myrtle round the unblunted dart of Eros. But though thou hast play'd us many tricks, still we respect thee, Alma Venus genitrix. And full of sentiments, sublime as billows heaving between this world and worlds beyond, Don Juan, when the midnight hour of pillows arrived, retired to his, but to despond rather than rest. Instead of poppies, willows waved o'er his couch. He meditated, fond of those sweet bitter thoughts which banish sleep, and make the worldling sneer, the youngling weep. The night was as before. He was undressed, saving his nightgown, which is an undress, completely sans culotte, and without vest. In short, he hardly could be clothed with less; but apprehensive of his spectral guest, he sat with feelings awkward to express by those who have not had such visitations, expectant of the ghost's fresh operations. And not in vain he listened. Hush! What's that? I see. Oh no, 'tis not, yet 'tis, ye powers, it is the pooh, the cat. The devil may take that stealthy pace of his, so like a spiritual pitter-pat, or tiptoe of an amatory miss, gliding the first time to a rendezvous, and dreading the chaste echoes of her shoe. Again, what is't? The wind? No, this time it is the sable friar as before, with awful footsteps, regular as rhyme, or, as rhymes may be in these days, much more. Again, through shadows of the night sublime, when deep sleep fell on men, and the world wore the starry darkness round her like a girdle spangled with gems, the monk made his blood curdle. A noise like to wet fingers drawn on glass, which sets the teeth on edge, and a slight clatter like showers which on the midnight gusts will pass, sounding like very supernatural water, came over Juan's ears, which throbbed, alas! For immaterialism's a serious matter, so that even those whose faith is the most great in souls immortal shun them tête-à-tête. Were his eyes open? Yes, and his mouth too. Surprise has this effect, to make one dumb, yet leave the gate which eloquence slips through as wide as if a long speech were to come. Nigh and more nigh the awful echoes drew, Tremendous to a mortal tympanum. His eyes were open, and, as was before stated, his mouth. What opened next? The door. It opened with a most infernal creak, like that of hell. Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, the hinges seemed to speak, dreadful as Dante's Rima, or this stanza, but all words upon such themes are weak. A single shade sufficient to entrance hero, for what is substance to a spirit? Or housed matter trembles to come near it. The door flew wide, not swiftly, but as fly the seagulls, with a steady sober flight, and then swung back, nor close, but stood awry, half letting in long shadows on the light, which still in Juan's candlesticks burned high, for he had two, both tolerably bright, and in the doorway, darkening darkness, stood the sable friar in his solemn hood. Don Juan shook, as erst he had been shaken the night before, but being sick of shaking, he first inclined to think he had been mistaken, and then to be ashamed of such mistaking. His own internal ghost began to awaken within him, and to quell his corporate quaking, hinting that soul and body on the whole were odds against a disembodied soul. And then his dread grew wrath, and his wrath fierce, and he arose, advanced, the shade retreated. But Juan, eager now the truth to pierce, followed, his veins no longer cold, but heated, resolved to thrust the mystery, cart and tierce, at whatsoever risk of being defeated. The ghost stopped, menaced, then retired, until he reached the ancient wall, then stood stone still. Juan put forth one arm. Eternal powers! It touch'd no soul nor body, but the wall, on which the moonbeams fell in silvery showers, chequer'd with all the tracery of the hall. He shudder'd, as no doubt the bravest cowers, when he can't tell what is't that doth appal. How odd a single hobgoblin's nonentity should cause more fear than a whole host's identity! But still the shade remained, the blue eyes glared, and rather variably for a stony death. Yet one thing rather good the grave had spared, the ghost had a remarkably sweet breath. A straggling curl show'd he had been fair-haired, a red lip with 2 rows of pearls beneath gleam'd forth, as through the casement's ivory shroud the moon peep'd, just escaped from a grey cloud, and Juan, puzzled, but still curious, thrust his other arm forth. Wonder upon wonder, it press'd upon a hard but glowing bust, which beat as if there was a warm heart under. He found, as people on most trials must, that he had made at first a silly blunder, and that in his confusion he had caught only the wall instead of what he sought. The ghost, if ghost it were, seem'd a sweet soul as ever lurked beneath the holy hood. A dimpled chin, a neck of ivory, stole forth into something much like flesh and blood. Back fell the sable frock and dreary cowl, and they revealed, alas, that ere they should, in full voluptuous, but not all grown bulk, the phantom of her frolic grace, Fitzfulke. End of Canto 16 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron, read by Peter Gallagher.